Welcome to Chromaticus. Today we're going to break down the Overture from Gazza Ladra by Rossini. I couldn't find a performance under Creative Commons, so we're going to have to listen to the Sibelius playback version. Sequence is okay, but if you want to listen to the live performance, there's a link down below, and then you can just skip the next 2 minutes. As always, we are in score in C. This just means that the transposing instruments are just reading in concert pitch. That way you don't have to transpose in your head while we're studying the score. It just makes it easier for everybody. So maestoso, marziale. Maestoso is majestically or stately, which is essentially large and impressive or beautiful. And marziale is martial, so it's of or relating to the military or suited for war. So essentially it's grand, impressive military music, which kind of makes sense when you listen to it. And yes, I had to look all of those words up. And the last thing before we get started is the fermatas. This is just a marking. You can be over a rest or a note, and it just means to hold it for longer than the actual value. And it's usually up to the conductor. He'll give a gesture when he wants that value to stop and go into the next bar. This piece starts off with a simple gesture here in the snare drum. By starting off with a single element like this and holding off on the melody and the harmony for a few bars, it sort of gives a little bit of a sense of anticipation of what's to come. And then in the third measure, he starts the melody first, and then not till the fourth measure does he bring in the entire harmony. So he's sort of staggering the different ideas, the rhythm, the melody, and then the harmony. And by doing so, it makes a much more unique introduction to the piece. The melody begins with a very grand, powerful statement in the violins 1 and violins 2, as well as piccolo and a flute in octaves. Remember, this piccolo is reading up an octave. And the clarinets and bassoons, just the first clarinet and the first bassoon on the upper line here and here, are playing the melody, whereas the lower clarinet and the lower bassoon are actually playing the harmony. So they have sort of a split function there, even though they're reading and written on the same staff. The harmony is in violas, cellos, and then the contrabass in octaves with the cellos. Remember, contrabass still transposes down an octave. This is just to avoid lots of ledger lines. It's really difficult to read when you get to 4 and 5 ledger lines below or above the staff. Also playing the harmony, we have the oboes 1 and 2, and remember the lower clarinet as well as the lower bassoon also playing the harmony. What's really fascinating here, and you'll see this a lot in orchestral works, is that both clarinets start out in unison, playing that initial part of the melody, and so do the bassoons. It's in the next measure that they split their functions here, and then at the end of this measure, they join back in unison. Here he actually gives one bassoon a rest, while the other plays the melody, and then again split functions here. This, I would say, is most useful when you want to highlight a really important part of the melody. give it a little bit more of a lift. So in this initial statement here, it has that really bright, really expressive quality to it. So we have those unisons, and then afterwards a little less focus on that melody. Also playing the harmony, we have the entire brass section. That is a very powerful, very loud section right there, especially in that dynamic. But the melody is also quite powerful, so it'll balance pretty well. When you have two string sections, that's a lot of players, and there's also all those woodwinds playing. So it requires a pretty powerful accompaniment. I would also include the timpani with the harmony section rather than with the percussion section, mostly because it's playing along with the rhythm of the brass here. So it follows along with the rhythm section, but timpani is also sort of a tuned instrument, so you actually have melodic notes instead of just rhythmic hits and percussive sounds. A lot of this piece is largely homophonic, which means that the melody and the harmony have the same rhythm, so there's not a lot of independence between the two. But if you notice that every measure he sort of switches that, so he has a homophonic measure, and then in the next measure the harmony gets rhythmic independence, and then it goes back to homophonic. So he's switching back and forth, which is really important. If he was to, or if you're writing music and you were to write the entire passage in homophonic writing, it gets kind of stale and boring after a while. So by switching it up, in this case every measure, it makes it much more interesting. On the last beat of measure 3, he starts the melody. When the harmony comes in, it's that homophonic writing I was just talking about. We have the exact same rhythm of the melody and the harmony. This is a really powerful effect, but it gets boring and stale if you continue it forever. So what he does in the very next bar, when he has this sustained melody note here, is the harmony section continues with that steady rhythm for some variation between the two lines. Now here the bass is doing something different than the rest of the harmony, but if you'll notice exactly what he's doing here, it looks just like this part of the melody. So this is not an entirely new idea, it's sort of a imitation of that melodic idea in the upper melody down in the bass. That keeps things really cohesive and sort of unified throughout, rather than always writing different rhythms in every bar and then it just kind of gets away from you and gets lost. You have quite a few options to add some variety and excitement to what otherwise might be just a static held bass note. You can jump up and down in octaves. You can use chromatic or diatonic neighbor tones. You could use a trill to add that little fluttery feeling. Now, Rossini is kind of a madman, so he does all three, because why not? And you end up with this very active, very colorful figure in the cellos and the bass. I feel with this much activity with the trill and the neighbor tones, it might be a little bit unclear what the true bass note is. So if you notice, he has in the tuba and the third trombone, the bass note held steady while this figure is going on to make sure the harmony is clarified completely. If we take a look at the brass section in the harmony, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on here. So the first thing is actually really simple, but you will see it a lot in orchestral music. The tuba is an octave below the trombone on the first beat, on the downbeat. Then it jumps up an octave and joins in unison for the bulk of the measure with the trombone. And then at the end of the measure, the last beat, it jumps back down an octave. This is really common in your bass sections. And part of the reason that it sounds so good and it's so effective is because this octave here is expanding the orchestral size. And then you're shrinking the orchestral size and adding a little bit more weight to this part of the bass here. And then you're expanding the size again and going back to a downbeat with a fuller orchestral size. If you always have the bass instruments super far down low, it can get very tiresome for the ear, so this variation sort of breaks that up. If we look at the rest of the brass section, 2 horns drop out at the end of the measure, as well as the 2 trumpets, and then trombones 1 and 2 also drop out on the next downbeat. So we have this sort of thinning out of the brass section of the harmony. When you listen to this, you can really hear that sort of opening up in the harmony section, and it makes the melodic line have a little more prominence to it. This variation is very useful for keeping things moving, keeping things interesting, and giving the melody a little bit more room to shine in certain areas. Let's look at the harmony real quick and see how it's arranged in the orchestra. I know for me, this is one of the most daunting tasks for a beginner composer, is when you're trying to write a chord for the entire orchestra. How do you arrange it? How do you assign different notes to different instruments? And how do you get balance? But if you look at this example, it's not quite as complicated as it might seem. It's really just a lot of repetition of the triad in different octaves. There's some interlocking and overlapping between different instruments for good balance. So let's take a look. Here's the breakdown of the harmony accompaniment by section. In the string section, you have the cellos and bass playing the root in octaves, very typical. The violas are playing the root and the third. Notice that they're playing divisi. That means only half the players are playing the E and the other half are playing the G sharp. The timpani plays the root in the first measure, and then it plays the fifth in the second measure. And the brass section is where most of the meat of the harmony of the accompaniment actually is. You have the tuba, again, playing the low bass note along with the basses. And then they jump up an octave like this. So does the tuba. It jumps up and joins trombone 3 right in here, and then comes back down the octave. So the rest of the brass section here completes the triad in 2 octaves. You have the trombone 3 on the root, trombone 2 on the third, and then it looks like you're skipping the fifth here, but actually the horn 4 is playing the fifth here. So by putting that horn in between 2 of the trombones, it helps the sections blend a little bit better. So the trombone 1 is playing the root again in the next octave along with trumpet 2 and horn 2 in unison here. And then the horn 1 plays the third, and the trumpet 1 and horn 3 play the fifth here. So that completes the triad in 2 octaves in the brass section, plus the extra octave of the root down below. And the woodwind section is really similar to that. It's basically the triad in 2 octaves. You have the E in bassoon number 2, you have the G sharp in clarinet number 2, and then oboes 1 and 2 play the E and the G sharp. Now it looks like the fifth is missing, but if you remember from the melody, the clarinet 1 and the bassoon 1 were playing the melody. They were playing a different role. And the melody in this section happens to be the note B. So there's actually a clarinet playing B in here, and there's another bassoon playing a B in here. So technically the woodwinds do complete the triad in 2 octaves between the harmony and the melody. So if you look at the breakdown of the accompaniment, you have 11 roots, 5 thirds, and 3 fifths. Now, normally you would have less thirds than fifths, but again, I think the reason that he did it this way is because that melody note all throughout here is B. It's the fifth. So you have the violins 1 and 2, you have the flutes, you have the other clarinet, the other bassoon, you have all these instruments playing B. So I think if he balanced this chord in the normal way with more fifths, when you add in the melody with all those other fifths, there would just be way too many fifths. So I think that's why he voiced it this way. In the middle here, you have just horns 1 and 2. The rest of the brass section is actually resting right here. So this is a much smaller part of the accompaniment. There's a little bit more space for the melody to breathe. And then the trumpets 1 and 2 and the horns 3 and 4 join back in for the rest of the measure here. Now let's check out the percussion section, because this I think is very, very useful for learning how to write percussion in an orchestra. So in measure 4, the triangle and the snare are playing together with the exact rhythm of the harmony and the melody. But the bass drum is just playing steady quarter notes here. It doesn't play that note right there. The bass drum is very, very heavy, and too much abusing of the bass drum tends to get a little bit muddy sounding. So going easy at certain times and varying the rhythm a little bit to hit the more powerful notes, the downbeats, is pretty common. In the next measure here, this is where things get really awesome. See, the bass drum is continuing that steady quarter notes there. The triangle now joins the bass drum into steadiness. It's not playing that rhythm anymore. Now, he's really clever here with the snare drum. He has that little triplet figure in the eighth notes, and it's sort of an active rhythmic figure at a time that the rest of the piece is not rhythmically active. So the melody is sustaining a long tone. A lot of the harmony instruments have dropped out completely. The tubas and the trombones are sustaining that bass note. So there's a lot of rhythmic rest in the other areas, and it's a perfect time to add that little sort of snare drum fill or whatever you want to call it. This is also common to add like counter melodies during those periods of rest as well, because that's where they really come out, because they're not being overshadowed by an active melody or an active harmony. Let's take a quick listen to these few bars again. This time, actively listen to where the brass drops out of the harmony and opens up that space for the melody and the little snare fill, and then right after that, where the bass and the cellos do those little ornamentations of the bass note. Now this repeats and stays almost the same with a little bit of variation until we get to measure 9, moving into measure 10. In measure 10, we have this really interesting run that we're going to break down in a second. At the end of measure 9, the melody changes just a little bit. We have this little rhythmic figure here pulling us into that run. We have the piccolo and flute in unison now. We have one oboe playing. The clarinets are joining together to play in unison. We have the one bassoon resting while the other one joins in, pulling into the run. Most of the brass section is resting. We have one trombone down a few octaves also playing that little melodic figure. So this gives us a nice room to breathe, and then this sort of gives some extra power of that line going into the run. And same thing in the string sections. We have the violins 1 and 2 playing that end of that melody, pulling into the run, and then the rest of the string section resting. So at measure 10, we have the sort of scale run. It's mostly running through a B7. This last beat here is an E major, and then it goes back to the B dominant. And you can see it in the harmony too. We have B, B, and then there's this little E chord here, and then back to the B. The run repeats 3 times, and it varies each time in the orchestra. This is how the masters use the orchestra to keep a repeated idea exciting for the listener. He's changing the instrumentation each time, he's shrinking down the orchestra each time, and by the end, he has a very distinct change in tone color. So the first time, it's in piccolo, it's in oboe, and 2 clarinets. And it's also in the violins 1 and 2. So this run is very powerful, it's very strong, and you're going to need a very powerful harmonic accompaniment to go with that. And the harmony is quite powerful. We have it in flutes, in bassoons, the entire brass section again, as well as viola, cellos, and bass. And if you zoom in, the entire percussion section is also playing along with the harmony. When you have notes like this in harmony, with like an 8th note with a staccato marking and an accent, it's supposed to be a very punchy sort of sound. The percussion obviously does that really, really well. So it blends very well. It adds that nice accent, that nice punchy effect to go in with the other instruments. In the second iteration of the run, it shrinks down quite a bit. You have 1 flute here, you have an oboe, and you have a clarinet only playing the first half of the run, and then it actually joins in the harmony, so it gets even a little bit thinner at the second half of the run. This variation in the run here gives a pretty stark contrast to the first iteration because you have less instruments, we don't have a string section anymore, it's just woodwinds, and we don't even have the piccolo playing way, way up high in that high range. So it's shrunk down a lot in volume and orchestral size. The harmonic accompaniment is in bassoons. In the second half, the clarinets join in. It's in all 4 horns and the trumpets. And there's also quite a lot of dovetailing going on, which is very important. So at the end of the piccolo line, instead of dropping out at the end of the measure, you have this nice dovetailing going into the next iteration of the line. You have the trombones and the tuba just playing the downbeat, and then they drop out. The percussion section also does the same thing, just on the downbeat. And then if you look at the strings, same thing. The melodic line is dovetailed with the beginning of the next iteration, and then all the harmony as well is just on the downbeat, and then it drops out. And the violas also join in the second half, along with those clarinets up here. And in the last iteration of this run, you have it in a solo horn. So notice that as he's shrinking down, he's not just cutting out instruments, he's also changing the instrumentation. So the first iteration, we had woodwinds and we had strings. In the second iteration, we had woodwinds, but slight variation. There was no piccolo anymore, and then we had a flute. And in the last iteration, we have just a solo brass instrument. So we've changed not only the instrumentation and the size, but we've also changed the tone color. The harmonic accompaniment also shrinks. You have the clarinets this time. You have 2 bassoons in the beginning, but then just 1 bassoon at the end. You have 3 horns. You have 2 horns here, and then if you look, we also have the other horn playing along the harmony as well. Let's listen to this awesome run again, and this time pay attention to the orchestration changing each time, as well as the overall effect of the shifting tone color from beginning to end. In measure 14, it repeats again in the same way as before, and then there's variation when we get to the run. So let's skip to the run and go over the variation now. So when we get to bar 20 and he plays the run again, this is where we have variation. Look at the accidentals here. We have an E sharp and we have an A sharp. So the run itself is the same rhythmically, and the harmonic accompaniment is treated in a similar manner. But what's changing is the mode. He's using a modal change. So for the first half, instead of B mixolydian, it's actually B Lydian. It's really just a brightening of that 5 chord, because Lydian is essentially the brightest sound. And then with the E natural here, it's going to be major, which is a little bit less bright, but still brighter than mixolydian. And then the last triplet at the end, we have an F sharp dominant chord going back to the B. The run this time is in flutes and piccolos again. as well as the violins 1 and 2. So we have that nice big statement like we did the first time. And the harmonic accompaniment is also, again, nice and bold and strong. We had the violas, the cellos, the contrabass playing the accompaniment. We have the brass section again. The tuba just plays on the downbeats here and here, but the rest of the brass section plays the harmony the whole time. And we also have the oboes, the clarinets, and the bassoons. The second iteration is in flute and 1 clarinet, while the harmony is in oboes, bassoons, as well as 2 horns. These 2 horns just play on the downbeat. Same thing with the trumpets. You get both on the downbeat, but then just 1 for the rest of the passage. The trombones here, 2 just on the downbeat, but then only the 3rd trombone actually plays the rest of the harmony. And we also have the violas, and the same thing as before, the dovetailing with the violins, and just the downbeat for the cellos and the bass. Also, the percussion section just plays on the downbeat, and then it also drops out as we get into a smaller and smaller texture moving through this line, or rather the repeat of this line. And in the last iteration, we have a solo bassoon playing the run. Remember last time it was a solo horn, so we had that sort of mellow, soft quality of a quiet solo horn to end the run. And this time we had that sort of nasal quality of the bassoon to end the run. So there's a big variation of the tone color that ends the run each time. And the harmony shrinks as well. We have 2 oboes, the 2 clarinets, the 2 horns, and also that other bassoon playing in the harmony as well. After this run, at the end of measure 23, we have the beginning of the melody again, but this time we have what's called an intermediate modulation. An intermediate modulation is a temporary modulation of an entire phrase, which then returns to the home key. Because these modulations are short-lived, the ear will retain the memory of the first key, and the return to the first key makes it appear as if no real modulation has taken place. It's important to note the degrees to which he modulates. The original key of E, if you look at the tonal degrees, which are the degrees that define the tonality, the root, the fourth, and the fifth, you have E, A, and B. Well, when he modulates, he first modulates to B, and then he modulates to A. So he's modulating to the tonal degrees to help keep that strength of the original key, which he's going to modulate back to, and that is why it's called an intermediate modulation. So even though he changes the mode and he uses B minor and A minor, the strength of the tonal degrees is still there. Now we're going to listen to this in a minute, but in measure 24, when he has this repeat of the theme, this time instead of being in E major, it's in B minor. And after he plays the theme in B minor, he modulates again, this time to A minor. So on the top here, we have the original theme in E major, which we're going to listen to first just to get your ears familiar with it. And then on the bottom here, we have the modulations where he goes to B minor and then A minor. Afterwards, he returns to the original key in E major and repeats. After the repeat of the original theme, this brings us up to measure 42. We have another modulation here, this time to C major. When you're in a major key and you play the flat 6 chord, or you modulate to the flat 6 degree, it has a very exotic sound to it. I highly encourage you to play around with the flat 6 degree in a major key. Let's take a listen now to the original melody and the new modulation in C major, and also note again there is a little bit of motivic variation, just like there was the last time. And when he gets back to that run at the very end, not much really changes. It's the same kind of stuff we heard earlier. The only big difference is these triple stops in the strings. If we zoom in, we have triple stops in the violins too, and also one at the very end of the violins. Triple stops are very effective for this sort of punchy, staccato feel because of how they work on a string instrument. You couldn't write a sustained passage with triple or quadruple stops. It has to be a short, punctuated chord because you're pulling the bow at a curve across all the strings, so you have to move really quickly to get them all. And then at the end, he uses the snare motif from the beginning, so he sort of caps both ends of the piece with that containing the rest of the music within. Per the usual, I'm going to end with a quote, this one from Debussy. "Works of art make rules, but rules do not make works of art." So if you're like me and you really love music theory, I still read music theory books all the time to learn new things to improve my composing. It should never hold you back if you have a really weird idea or a bizarre chord change that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense theoretically, but you love the sound of. Just go with it. Remember that you're making art, so do whatever wacky, weird stuff you want to do and make some really great art. That's going to do it for us today. Keep studying, keep learning, keep growing. See you next time.